The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Blue Corner Cafe, one of those fancy coffee shops where a single cup costs more than a whole lunch. The place buzzed with the usual morning crowd. Business people in expensive suits, typing away on laptops or chatting about their next big deal. James Barrett stood in line, checking his golden watch every few seconds, as if that would make the line move faster. His crisp navy suit and perfectly styled gray hair screamed successful lawyer, and he made sure everyone knew it. 20 years at the top law firm in the city had given him the kind of confidence that often crossed into arrogance. Just then, a woman in a charcoal gray pantsuit walked in. Her name was Angela Washington, though Barrett wouldn't bother to learn that until it was too late. She carried a leather briefcase and had the kind of quiet grace that turned heads, but Barrett only saw what he wanted to see. When Angela accidentally bumped his elbow while reaching for a sugar packet, Barrett turned around with the kind of look usually reserved for something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with fake politeness, "but the service entrance is around back." The cafe went oddly quiet. A few people looked up from their phones and laptops, catching the scene unfolding before them. Angela straightened her spine, adjusted her glasses, and met his gaze with remarkable composure. "I'm a customer, just like you," she replied, her voice steady and clear. Barrett let out a short laugh that made several people cringe. "Right. And I suppose that briefcase is full of cleaning supplies." He gestured to her expensive leather bag with a dismissive wave. The barista behind the counter, who had served Angela her morning coffee for the past 3 years, opened his mouth to say something, but Angela gave him a slight shake of her head. She'd handled far worse than an arrogant lawyer who couldn't see past his own prejudices. Instead of arguing, Angela simply stepped closer to the counter and said, "I'll have my usual, Tom, and I'll pay for this gentleman's drink too." She pulled out her premium credit card, the kind Barrett probably had in his own wallet. Barrett's face twitched with confusion, but he quickly covered it with another smirk. "How charitable," he said, emphasizing the word like it was some kind of insult. He didn't even bother to look at her as he grabbed his coffee and headed for the door, his shoulders back and head held high like he owned the place. As he left, Angela noticed his name on the coffee cup, James Barrett, written in Tom's neat handwriting. She pulled out her phone and made a quick note, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. The other customers who had witnessed the scene started whispering among themselves. Tom leaned over the counter as he handed Angela her drink. "You should have let me tell him who you are," he said, shaking his head. Angela took a sip of her perfectly made latte and smiled. "Don't worry, Tom. Something tells me he's going to find out soon enough." She picked up her briefcase, nodded goodbye to the regular morning crowd, and walked out into the sunshine, her mind already turning to the big case waiting on her desk. Little did James Barrett know, but his perfect record was about to meet its match. His coffee might have been free that morning, but the lesson he was about to learn would cost him something far more valuable than money: his pride. Angela walked into her law office, still thinking about the encounter at the coffee shop. The sign on her door read Washington and Associates in elegant gold letters, a reminder of how far she'd come from the days when people like Barrett made her doubt herself. Her office breathed success, but not in a showy way. Family photos sat next to her law degrees from Harvard, and the view of the city skyline stretched out behind her desk. A wall of books showed years of case law research, each spine worn from actual use, not just for show. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," Angela called out to her assistant, who was already juggling 3 phone calls. The older woman covered the phone's mouthpiece and whispered, "The Richardson file is on your desk. It's big." Angela nodded, pushing the coffee shop incident to the back of her mind. Inside her office, a thick manila folder waited on her desk. As she opened it, her eyes widened. The Richardson case wasn't just big. It was exactly the kind of case she built her career fighting for. 23 employees had come forward with evidence of systematic discrimination at one of the city's largest corporations. Passed over for promotions, hostile work environment, unfair dismissals. The pattern was clear as day. Angela felt that familiar fire in her belly, the one that got her through law school and helped her build her firm from scratch. She spent the next few hours diving deep into the details. Her desk became a sea of sticky notes and highlighted documents. This wasn't just another case. This was a chance to create real change. The kind of change that could help people who'd faced the same prejudices she'd encountered that very morning. Her phone buzzed. "Mrs. Washington." Mrs. Chen's voice came through. "The potential clients are here." The conference room filled up with nervous energy as people filed in. These weren't high-powered executives or wealthy clients. They were ordinary folks who'd worked hard only to hit a ceiling they couldn't break through. Angela saw her own parents in their faces, remembered their struggles, their dignity. "Before we start," Angela said, standing at the head of the table, "I want you all to know something. What happened to you? It's not okay. And we're going to do something about it." For the next 2 hours, she listened to their stories. A maintenance worker with 20 years' experience, repeatedly passed over for supervisor roles. An accountant whose department head made her life impossible until she quit. Each story made Angela's determination stronger. Back in her office, Angela started planning their strategy. The corporation would hire a top firm to defend them, probably someone from the old boys club who tried to paint this as a money grab. She smiled, thinking about how they'd underestimate her. They always did. Her phone buzzed again. "Mrs. Washington." The court just sent over the defense counsel information for the Richardson case. Angela picked up the document, and her smile grew wider. There, in black and white, was the name. James Barrett, senior partner, representing the defense. She thought back to that morning, to his smirk, his assumptions, to the way he'd dismissed her without a second thought. Now he'd have to face her across a courtroom, and no amount of expensive suits or arrogance would help him there. Angela opened her laptop and began typing. She had work to do, and this time, it wasn't just about winning a case. It was about teaching someone a lesson they desperately needed to learn. Not through humiliation or revenge, but through the simple power of justice being served. "Game on, Mr. Barrett," she whispered to herself, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she worked late into the evening. Building a case that would change more than just a company's policies. It would change at least one man's entire worldview. The morning sun bounced off the glass walls of Barrett's corner office as he stood looking out over the city. His reflection smiled back at him. Another day, another case he was sure to win. The Richardson discrimination lawsuit had landed on his desk yesterday, and he couldn't be more pleased. "Listen up, everyone," Barrett announced to the junior lawyers gathered in his office. Their fresh faces looked up at him eagerly, notepads ready. These meetings were famous or infamous, depending on who you asked. This is how you handle a discrimination case. He walked around his massive desk, picking up the case file with 2 fingers like it was something lightweight and unimportant. These people think they can get rich quick by crying discrimination. We've seen it 100 times before. He dropped the file back on his desk with a theatrical thud. One of the junior lawyers, a quiet woman in the back, raised her hand slightly. "Sir, I looked through the evidence. Their claims seem pretty solid." Barrett cut her off with a laugh that made everyone else in the room force a smile. "Solid. Please, I've been winning these cases since you were in grade school." He straightened his tie, catching his reflection in the window again. 20 years, not a single loss. "You know why?" "Because I know how to play this game." The young lawyers exchanged glances. They'd heard about Barrett's methods, how he'd tear apart witness testimonies, how he'd make discrimination seem like poor performance, how he turned everything around until black looked white and white looked black. "Now," Barrett continued, walking between the chairs, "we don't know who's representing them yet, but it doesn't matter. Probably some fresh-faced idealist from a small firm trying to make a name for themselves." He chuckled, remembering the woman from the coffee shop. These people were all the same, thinking they could change the world. Another junior lawyer cleared his throat. Actually, sir, the plaintiff's counsel information just came in this morning. I was about to. Doesn't matter. Barrett waved his hand dismissively. Probably someone who'll be impressed by our firm's reputation alone. These discrimination cases are trivial. Just a matter of showing that any unfair treatment was actually just poor performance or bad attitude. The junior lawyers scribbled in their notepads, but their faces showed doubt. They'd all studied discrimination law in school. They knew these cases weren't as simple as Barrett made them sound. Sir, the first woman spoke up again, braver this time. Shouldn't we at least look at their counsel's track record? Barrett rolled his eyes. Fine, if it'll make you feel better. Who are we up against? He held out his hand for the document. The junior lawyer's hand trembled slightly as she passed him the paper. Barrett's eyes scanned the page, his confident smile frozen in place. Then, slowly, the smile began to fade. Washington and Associates. He muttered, more to himself than the room. Something tugged at his memory, something from this morning. A briefcase, a coffee shop, a woman he'd dismissed. The color drained from his face as the pieces clicked into place. The woman from the coffee shop, the one he'd assumed was a cleaner, the one who'd paid for his coffee with a premium card. Everyone out, he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual boom. The junior lawyers hurried to leave, stealing glances at their usually unshakable boss, who now stood staring at the document like it might bite him. Once alone, Barrett sank into his chair and pulled up Washington and Associates on his computer. There she was, Angela Washington, founder and lead attorney, known for never losing a discrimination case, known for turning down million-dollar settlements if they didn't include policy changes, known for being exactly the kind of lawyer he'd just finished mocking. For the first time in 20 years, James Barrett felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: doubt. And somewhere across the city, in another office, Angela Washington was preparing to teach him the lesson of a lifetime. The courthouse hallway buzzed with morning activity. Barrett strode through the security checkpoint, his expensive leather briefcase swinging confidently at his side. Today was the preliminary hearing for the Richardson case, and despite his recent discovery about opposing counsel, he'd convinced himself nothing had changed. They're just trying to intimidate us with a big name, he told his team earlier. But the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his tie betrayed his true feelings. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, heavy wood panels that had seen thousands of cases come and go. Barrett reached for the handle, then froze. Through the door's window, he caught sight of a familiar figure arranging papers at the plaintiff's table. Angela Washington stood exactly as she had in the coffee shop, poised, professional, and completely in her element. Only now, instead of a coffee cup, she held a stack of documents that Barrett suspected would make his morning very uncomfortable. He pushed through the doors, trying to maintain his usual commanding presence. The sound made Angela look up, and their eyes met. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't quite not a smile either. "Good morning, Mr. Barrett," she said pleasantly, as if they were meeting for the first time. "I believe you bought my coffee the other day." A few of her clients, sitting in the gallery, exchanged confused looks. Barrett felt heat rise in his collar. Before he could respond, the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Chen presiding. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, took her seat and surveyed the room. "Richardson versus Capital Corp. Preliminary hearing. Are both parties ready?" "Ready, Your Honor," Angela responded, her voice clear and confident. Barrett cleared his throat. "Ready, Your Honor," he managed, though his voice cracked slightly. As Angela rose to present her opening statement, Barrett noticed something different about her. She wasn't just prepared, she was practically glowing with purpose. This wasn't just another case for her. "Your Honor," She began, "This case isn't about a few isolated incidents. It's about a pattern of discrimination so deeply rooted in Capital Corp's culture that it's become invisible to those in power." Her eyes flickered briefly to Barrett, or rather, invisible to those who choose not to see it. Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Each word felt personally aimed at him, though he knew she was talking about his client. When his turn came, Barrett stood up, straightening his tie one last time. He launched into his usual defense strategy, but the words felt hollow even to his own ears. "These claims are purely subjective, Your Honor. The plaintiffs are attempting to turn ordinary business decisions into something they're not." Judge Chen's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Barrett, that 23 separate incidents across different departments over 5 years are all coincidental?" Well, Barrett stumbled, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. This wasn't going according to plan. Angela stood again, holding up a thick folder. "Your Honor, we have documented evidence of qualified candidates being passed over, of hostile work environments, of systematic barriers to advancement. But more importantly," she paused, making sure she had everyone's attention, "we have proof that management was aware of these issues and chose to ignore them." The judge leaned forward, interested. Barrett felt sweat forming on his forehead. In all his years of practicing law, he'd never felt so thoroughly outmaneuvered. And this was just the preliminary hearing. As the hearing concluded, Barrett watched Angela pack up her briefcase. The same one he'd mockingly suggested contained cleaning supplies. Now it held documents that threatened not just his perfect record, but everything he thought he knew about his own profession. "Mr. Barrett," Angela called as he headed for the door. He turned, bracing himself. "See you in discovery." Her smile was professional, but her eyes held a promise. The real lesson was just beginning. Angela sat at her desk late into the evening, surrounded by stacks of employee records, internal memos, and performance reviews. The soft glow of her desk lamp cast shadows on the walls as she pieced together the puzzle of discrimination at Capital Corp. "Look at this," she said to Mrs. Chen, who had stayed late to help. 3 employees with nearly identical qualifications. The only difference, she spread the papers out. The ones who got promoted all came from the same background as the senior management. Mrs. Chen adjusted her reading glasses, studying the documents, and they all had lower performance scores than the ones passed over. The investigation was revealing ugly truths about Capital Corp's culture. Email chains showed jokes about diversity hires. Meeting notes revealed qualified candidates being labeled as not a good cultural fit. Performance reviews praised some for being aggressive, while criticizing others for the exact same behavior. Angela's phone buzzed. A text from one of her clients. Another one just came forward. She told Mrs. Chen. "That makes 24 now." Meanwhile, across town, Barrett was facing his own revelations. Sitting in his home office, his tie loosened and jacket discarded, he stared at the evidence Angela's team had submitted. Each page seemed to mock his usual defense strategies. His daughter's voice came from the doorway. "Dad, you missed dinner again." Barrett looked up to see his 16-year-old standing there, still in her debate team uniform. "Sorry, sweetie. This case." She walked over, curious about what had her usually confident father so troubled. "What's it about?" "It's complicated," he started, but then remembered how she'd won her last debate about workplace equality. "Actually, maybe you can help me understand something." He showed her some of the evidence, the promotion patterns, the feedback differences, the cultural fit comments. His daughter's face grew serious as she read. "Dad," she said finally, "this is exactly what we talked about in debate. It's like when my friend Lisa got told she was too aggressive in student council, but when Tommy did the same thing, they call him leadership material." Barrett felt something shift inside him. Seeing it through his daughter's eyes made the patterns impossible to ignore. Back at Washington and Associates, Angela was building her case with surgical precision. Every document, every testimony, Every piece of evidence was carefully organized to show the bigger picture. Mrs. Washington called one of her junior associates from the conference room. "You need to see this." They'd found an internal presentation about diversity initiatives, a beautiful slideshow full of promises and goals. But buried in the email thread about it was a senior executive's response. "Just make it look good for the shareholders. No need to actually change anything." Angela added it to her growing collection of evidence. She wasn't just building a legal case anymore. She was documenting a culture of denial and dismissal, the same culture she'd experienced in that coffee shop. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was from Barrett's office, requesting a meeting to discuss the case. Angela smiled, remembering his face in the courtroom. "Should I schedule it?" Mrs. Chen asked. "Yes," Angela replied, "but not here. Let's meet at Blue Corner Cafe." She picked up one of the employee testimonies, a woman with 3 advanced degrees who'd been asked to serve coffee in meetings because she'd be better at it. "It's time Mr. Barrett sees what's been right in front of him all along," Angela said, closing the file for the night. Sometimes the best lessons happen over coffee. As she packed up her briefcase, the same one Barrett had mocked, Angela felt no anger toward him. Instead, she felt something like hope, because sometimes the biggest victories weren't just about winning cases, they were about changing minds. Barrett sat alone in his office, the city lights twinkling outside his window as evening settled in. His desk, usually perfectly organized, was covered with case files, but he wasn't reading them. He was lost in thought, remembering conversations from earlier that day. "Dad." His daughter's voice echoed in his head. "Remember when you told me I could be anything I wanted to be?" She'd stopped by his office after school, finding him buried in the Richardson case files. "Did you mean it? Or did you mean I could be anything as long as it fits what others expect?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd always prided himself on raising a strong, independent daughter. Yet here he was, defending a company that seemed determined to keep people in their proper place. His phone buzzed. Another message from his client at Capital Corp. "Just make this go away," they'd said, "whatever it costs." But for the first time in his career, Barrett wasn't sure money was the answer. He pulled up the security camera footage from the company's lobby that Angela's team had submitted as evidence. He'd watched it 10 times already, but something kept drawing him back. A young employee, clearly qualified, being stopped and questioned by security every single morning, while others walked right through. "It's just protocol," the company had claimed. But Barrett noticed how only certain employees faced these protocols. His eyes drifted to a photo on his desk, himself as a young lawyer, eager and idealistic. When had he stopped seeing the people behind the cases? When had winning become more important than justice? A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. It was the quiet junior lawyer from earlier in the case, the one who tried to warn him about the evidence. "Mr. Barrett, I found something interesting in the company's training materials." She hesitated, then continued. "They have different versions for different departments. The content, it's not the same." Barrett reviewed the documents she'd brought. The differences were subtle but clear. Some departments got comprehensive training about advancement opportunities. Others got basic job maintenance tips, the pattern of who got what was impossible to ignore. He opened his laptop, starting to type, then stopped, deleted everything, started again. For the first time in years, he was writing notes not about how to win, but about what was right. His daughter's debate team photo caught his eye. She stood proudly with her diverse team, all of them celebrating a victory. "Dad," she'd said just yesterday, "sometimes winning isn't about beating the other side. Sometimes it's about making things better." Barrett looked at his reflection in the darkened window. The same face that had smirked at Angela in the coffee shop now looked troubled, uncertain. He thought about all the cases he'd won, all the times he dismissed claims of discrimination as excuses. His phone buzzed again. Angela Washington's office confirming their coffee shop meeting for tomorrow. Barrett picked up his coffee cup, the same kind he'd been drinking when he'd made those dismissive comments weeks ago. "What a fool I've been," he muttered to himself. He started gathering the files, but not to build a defense. Instead, he began marking sections that showed the clearest evidence of discrimination. His hands trembled slightly. This wasn't just about losing a case anymore. It was about choosing which side of history he wanted to be on. As he worked late into the night, the cleaning staff came through. Barrett looked up, really seeing them for the first time. He noticed their professionalism, their dignity. He thought about how many times he'd walked past them without a glance, just like he'd dismissed Angela that day in the coffee shop. "Would you like coffee, sir?" one of them asked. "No, thank you," he replied, standing up. "But would you like to sit down for a moment? I think I need to hear your story." The courtroom was packed for the key witness testimony. Barrett stood at the podium, facing a longtime employee of Capital Corp. In the past, this would have been his moment to shine, to tear apart the witness's credibility with his trademark aggressive style. But something had changed. "Mr. Richards," Barrett began, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge, "you've worked at Capital Corp for 15 years, correct?" "Yes, sir," the witness replied. He sat straight-backed in his chair, hands folded calmly on the stand. Here was a man who had nothing to hide. Barrett glanced at his notes, then at Angela, who watched him with curious interest. He could feel the tension in the courtroom, everyone waiting for his usual attack. Instead, he asked softly, "Could you tell us about your qualifications?" The witness began listing his credentials: 2 master's degrees, numerous certifications, perfect performance reviews. With each achievement mentioned, Barrett felt his old defenses crumbling. "And in 15 years, you've applied for promotion how many times?" 17 times, sir." "And received how many?" "None." The gallery murmured. Barrett pulled out a document, one he'd found during his late-night soul-searching. "I have here the promotion records for your department. In the same period, 12 people were promoted. All of them." He paused, the words sticking in his throat. "All of them with fewer qualifications than you." Angela sat up straighter. This wasn't the cross-examination strategy they'd prepared for. The judge leaned forward, intrigued by this unexpected turn. "Mr. Richards, did anyone ever explain why you were passed over?" "They said I wasn't a good cultural fit," the witness replied, his dignity intact despite the years of rejection. Barrett nodded slowly. "A cultural fit." He let the words hang in the air. "Like how some people might not look like they belong in an upscale coffee shop." Angela's eyes widened slightly. She understood what Barrett was doing. He wasn't just questioning a witness anymore. He was publicly acknowledging his own prejudices. "Your Honor," Barrett said, turning to the judge, "I'd like to enter into evidence a new document." He pulled out a paper from his briefcase. "This is my own written statement about an incident at Blue Corner Cafe where He took a deep breath, "where I demonstrated the exact kind of prejudiced thinking that this case is about." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. This never happened. A defense lawyer providing evidence against his own biases. Angela watched Barrett carefully, seeing not an opponent being defeated, but a person finally seeing the truth. "Mr. Richards," Barrett continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction, "one last question. What would you say to someone who claims that discrimination doesn't exist in modern workplaces?" The witness looked Barrett directly in the eyes. "I'd say they haven't been paying attention." Barrett nodded. "No further questions, Your Honor." As he returned to his seat, he noticed his hands were shaking. His usual courtroom confidence was gone, replaced by something more valuable: understanding. The jury members exchanged glances. They'd expected a fierce legal battle, not this moment of raw honesty. Even the judge seemed moved by the unexpected turn of events. As Barrett sat down, he felt lighter somehow. He probably just lost the case for his client. But for the first time in his career, losing felt like winning. He glanced at his phone. A text from his daughter. "Proud of you, Dad." Angela stood for her follow-up questions, But she kept them brief. Barrett had already done what she'd hoped to accomplish. He'd shown that change was possible, that people could learn to see past their prejudices if they were willing to face them honestly. The truth, it turned out, was more powerful than any legal strategy. The conference room at Washington and Associates buzzed with tension. On one side sat Angela and her clients, on the other, Barrett and the Capital Corp executives. The morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the coffee cups that sat untouched on the polished table. "Our client is prepared to offer $12 million in damages," Barrett began, but his voice lacked its usual smugness. He glanced at Angela, then continued, "But I think we all know this isn't just about money." The CEO of Capital Corp shifted uncomfortably in his expensive chair. "Mr. Barrett, we hired you to end this, not to hide the truth," Barrett interrupted, surprising everyone. "I spent weeks reviewing the evidence. I've talked to your employees, not just the ones in corner offices, but the ones who cleaned those offices too." He pulled out a thick folder. "And I've prepared a proposal for systematic changes." Angela leaned forward, intrigued. This wasn't the same man who dismissed her in the coffee shop. The change in him was as real as it was unexpected. First, Barrett continued, a complete overhaul of the promotion system, blind review of applications, independent diversity committee with real power, not just for show. He looked directly at the CEO. And mandatory training. The same training for everyone, not different versions for different departments. One of the executives scoffed. "This is ridiculous. We'll find another lawyer, we'll tell you what you want to hear." Barrett stood up, his voice firm but calm. "I've been that lawyer for 20 years. Not anymore." Angela watched him with growing respect. She'd hoped to change the company's policies, but she hadn't expected to change Barrett himself. "Here's what's going to happen," Barrett said, addressing his own clients now. "We're going to acknowledge the discrimination. We're going to apologize, not with carefully worded corporate statements, but with real actions." He laid out the plan: back pay for passed-over employees, a new promotion review board with diverse representation, mentorship programs, and regular independent audits of hiring and promotion practices. "And what if we refuse?" the CEO asked, his face red with anger. "Then we go back to court," Angela spoke up, "where your own lawyer has already testified about systemic discrimination in your company." She smiled slightly. "How do you think that will play out?" The room fell silent. The executives whispered among themselves, shooting angry glances at Barrett. But he stood firm, remembering his daughter's words about making things better, not just winning. "There's one more thing," Barrett added, pulling out another document. "My resignation from the firm, effective immediately." He straightened his tie. "I can't defend discrimination anymore, subtle or obvious." The CEO stood up, furious. "You're throwing away 20 years off." "I'm finding my conscience," Barrett corrected him. "Something I should have done a long time ago." Angela watched as the executives huddled in the corner, whispering frantically. She could see the moment they realized they had no choice. Their own lawyer had switched sides, not officially, but morally, and that changed everything. "Fine," the CEO finally said. "We'll do it your way." He looked at Barrett with barely concealed contempt. "I hope you realize you're ending your career." Barrett smiled, thinking of his daughter's proud text message. "No," he said quietly. "I'm starting a new one." He turned to Angela. "If you're ever looking for a partner who's learned his lesson, I know a lawyer who's available." Angela couldn't help but smile. "Let's handle this case first," she said. "Then we'll talk about coffee." The settlement papers were drawn up within hours. As everyone filed out, Barrett lingered behind. "I owe you an apology," he said to Angela. That day in the coffee shop was the beginning of something important. She finished for him. Sometimes the best lessons are the hardest ones to learn. 6 months later, Blue Corner Cafe was buzzing with its usual morning crowd. Angela sat at a corner table, reviewing the latest progress report from Capital Corp. The changes were remarkable. New faces in management, improved employee satisfaction scores, and a workplace culture that was slowly but surely transforming. The bell above the door chimed, and Barrett walked in. He wasn't wearing his expensive suit anymore, having traded it for something more modest but no less professional. These days, he worked with a non-profit organization helping companies build truly inclusive workplaces. "Sorry I'm late," he said, sliding into the seat across from Angela. "Was finishing up a training session at Richards Industries." He smiled. "You know, our star witness from the case. His company hired me to help them do better." Tom, the barista, brought their usual orders without being asked. "On the house today," he said with a knowing smile. "Been quite a journey since that first morning, hasn't it?" Barrett nodded, remembering his arrogant behavior that day. "The biggest journeys start with the smallest steps," he said, "or in my case, with the biggest mistakes." Angela pulled out her tablet, showing him the latest numbers from Capital Corp. "Look at this. Promotions are up across all departments. Their diversity hiring isn't just for show anymore. Real changes, real opportunities." "And the best part," Barrett added, pulling out his own folder, "3 other major companies have adopted similar policies. They saw what happened with Capital Corp and decided to change before they faced their own lawsuits." A young woman approached their table hesitantly. "Mr. Barrett, I was an intern at Capital Corp during the case." She smiled shyly. "I just wanted to thank you. Because of the changes you helped make, I'm now in the management training program." Barrett stood and shook her hand, genuine warmth in his smile. "Thank Ms. Washington," he said. "She's the one who taught me to see what was right in front of me." After the young woman left, Angela raised an eyebrow. "You're getting soft in your old age, Barrett." "Not soft," he corrected, taking a sip of his coffee, "just finally seeing clearly." He glanced around the cafe. "You know, my daughter's starting law school next fall. Says she wants to fight for equality, just like her dad's new partner." Angela laughed. "Partner? I don't remember agreeing to that yet. Give it time." Barrett grinned. "I'm learning patience these days." Outside, the city was changing too. Small steps, everyday moments, people learning to see past their assumptions. The Capital Corp case had made headlines, not just for the settlement, but for the story of transformation it represented. Barrett's phone buzzed. Another company requesting his training services. "They keep coming," he said, showing Angela the message. "Turns out there's a real demand for someone who can speak from experience about changing their mindset." "And to think," Angela said, gathering her things, "it all started with a cup of coffee and an arrogant lawyer who needed a wake-up call." As they stood to leave, Barrett noticed a group of young lawyers at a nearby table, clearly discussing a case. He could see himself in them, the ambition, the drive. But he hoped they'd learn the lesson he'd learned, that true success isn't measured by cases won, but by lives changed. "Same time next week?" Angela asked, picking up her briefcase, the same one he'd once mocked. Barrett nodded, leaving a generous tip for Tom. "Wouldn't miss it. After all," he smiled, "I still have a lot to learn." They walked out into the morning sunshine, 2 lawyers who'd started as opponents and ended up as partners in change. Behind them, Blue Corner Cafe continued serving its morning crowd, a reminder that sometimes the biggest transformations happen in the most ordinary places.